We will be opposing this bill for a number of reasons. First of all, the manner in which this bill dealing with forestry in this country is being pushed through is an absolute disgrace. We are, even at this point, scrambling around, trying to get our heads around huge numbers of amendments, which in any event will never be debated and discussed, where all those amendments have been collapsed into the second stage of the debate. So it is going to be rammed through in a way that makes a mockery, frankly, of legislative scrutiny and of the democratic process. The fact that the Green Party are a party to this is shocking beyond belief, because I don't know how many times I've heard them wax lyrical about the need for a sustainable forestry model, about the critical importance of forestry in terms of climate change and biodiversity, and yet they are ramming through this bill, assisting the bigger parties in ramming through this bill, which could do significant, well, certainly won't address the huge crisis we face in a fundamentally dysfunctional forestry model, and indeed which could do very significant damage, in my opinion. So, aside from almost anything that's in the bill, the process is a disgrace, and it is good enough reason to oppose this bill, because we will not have time to properly scrutinise it. But then there is, if you like, what the bill is in actuality facilitating. And what it is facilitating is propping up a rotten, dysfunctional, environmentally damaging forestry model. A forestry model that is driven by profit, that isn't actually one that in any way reaches even close to the economic potential and employment potential that a proper forestry model would have, and which is propping up something that is doing intense, a forestry model that is doing intense environmental damage, as far as I'm concerned. You know, just to give you an indication of why I say that, in one day in 2019, there were 824 separate felling licenses submitted. 824 to clear 6,669 hectares of public forest. Over the next 3 months, a further 345 more licenses, felling licenses, up to in December 2019, covering a total of 9,527 hectares of public forests. Many of those might be subject to appeal. Now just think about those figures. That's 15,000 hectares of public forest to be felled. And that's just in the period of about half of last year. That many licenses. Many of those fellings could have potentially significant environmental damage and be subject to appeal. Now, those figures are very telling when you consider that we are planting about 4,000 hectares of forest, and for the most part, the wrong type of forest. But in a short period of time, licenses seeking to fell 15,000 hectares, but we're only planting 4,000. When Coford said that in order to actually reach our afforestation targets, to get us from the abysmal level of forest cover, which has been mentioned a number of times, is 11%, as against a European average of 30%, in a country that has the best conditions for growing trees anywhere in Europe, and we have consistently got nowhere near those targets. But when you add together what I've just said, what we're actually planting, as against a push for accelerated harvesting, the EPA, not surprisingly among others, have expressed deep concern that we may be in a situation of net deforestation. Deforestation. So going from an already bad situation to a worse situation. And people will say, and I had some lobbying from some of my colleagues here earlier on, legitimately worrying about the people who move the logs, the hauliers, and so on, the people who do the work of cutting down forests, or for that matter, planting them. And those concerns for employment and for people who earn their living from forestry are legitimate concerns. But I ask those colleagues to consider this. In Wallonia, which is covers a quarter of the territory of Belgium, there is a timber industry worth €4.5 billion, and it employs 18,000 people. In other words, in an area much smaller than this country, they have far more people employed in forestry, and the revenue is far greater. It is true. There's 12,000 people employed in Irish forestry. Huh? Yeah, and this is 3.5 billion, as I've just said. Sorry, 4.5 billion. 4.5 billion and 18,000. So we are massively underperforming in terms of the employment we could generate and the revenue we could generate if we had a good forestry model and a sustainable forestry model, rather than the monocultural industrial forestry model that may in fact be resulting in net deforestation, and where that model is also, because it's based largely on one species of tree, is actually quite damaging to soil, to water, makes our forests more prone to disease, and so on, and which is a fundamentally unsustainable industry. It might also be worth pointing out that it doesn't generate quality employment. So, for example, when Coillte was set up in 1989, there were 2,500 staff in the Forest Service. Today, there are 600, and about half of them are administrative staff. So the people who are actually getting jobs, in many cases in forestry, are poorly paid, immigrant labour, badly paid, with very insecure jobs, in fact not jobs at all, and where bogus self-employment is rampant, where workers' rights, paying conditions are subject to widespread abuse. That's not a sustainable or beneficial forestry model from an employment point of view, from a macroeconomic point of view, from an environmental point of view, from a biodiversity point of view. And against that background, the idea that we will try and restrict the right of people to object to planting or felling that is contributing to sustaining and propping up a unsustainable forestry model is not acceptable as far as I'm concerned. What we actually need is a thoroughly independent review of the entire forestry sector, rather than something that is trying to essentially cover the tracks of a failed policy. And if we did forestry right, we could actually create thousands and thousands of new, decent, quality jobs. A forestry model based on diverse forest species, on native woodlands, on native tree species, actually generate all sorts of knock-on industries from a different type of forestry. I mean, indeed, it is a shocking fact that in a country where we were once covered with native hardwood trees, that there is almost no native hardwood industry in this country at all, and we import much of our hardwood. That's shocking. when we have supreme conditions for growing quality hardwood trees. It's not the short-term profit model favoured by the pension funds, the sawmills, the big corporate interests who dominate Irish forestry, but it would actually be one that would genuinely benefit environmentally, employment-wise, economic-wise, communities, real communities, ordinary working people, and of course contribute, as we need to do, to addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. So on that basis we will be opposing this bill. We have a number of amendments, most of which have been submitted by the environmental pillar, something again that should give the Green Party pause for thought in supporting this bill, who have described this bill as shocking, and I think these are people that the Greens would have worked closely alongside, so maybe they could do something to explain how many of the people that they have campaigned with and worked with over many years believe this bill is retrograde, needs to be radically amended, and is not the legislation we need to actually develop a sustainable, environmentally sustainable and genuinely economically beneficial forestry sector in this country.